A blizzard howls through Wyoming's Wind River in 1887, cloaking a man who chose silence over salvation. Silas Boone, a former cavalry soldier, bears scars deeper than the mountain's frost, haunted by a boy's cries in a burning jail. For 6 winters, he's walled himself in a cabin, his only companions a rifle and a wolf dog. But when a child's desperate plea pierces the storm, his solitude cracks. Will this rugged recluse rewrite his past, or will the mountain claim another soul? Subscribe now to uncover the truth and share where you found this tale. Can one night thaw a frozen heart? Listen to find out. Snow screamed across the Wind River Range, clawing at the pines like a living thing, hungry and relentless. Wyoming, 1887, was a land that broke men before it bent to them, and Silas Boone knew its cruelty better than most. A former cavalry soldier, he'd traded the bugle's call for the silence of a cedar plank cabin, tucked deep in a hollow where the mountains stood like judges. 6 winters he'd endured, each colder than the last, his beard thick with frost, his hands calloused from swinging an axe. His only company was a Winchester rifle, propped by the door, and a wolf dog he'd pulled from a trap years back, its yellow eyes sharp as his own. Silas hadn't chosen this life. It had chosen him, forged in the ashes of a jailhouse fire where a boy's scream still echoed in his skull. That memory was a blade, cutting deeper than the wind. The storm hit hard that morning. The sky was a slab of iron, and the air was so cold it burned to breathe. Silas moved through the drifts, boots crunching, his breath coiling like smoke. The dog, named Grit by a whim he'd never explained, padded behind, ears pricked for sounds the blizzard tried to bury. They were headed for the creek, frozen solid now, where Silas checked traps for anything foolish enough to wander. He didn't expect to find life, not in this weather, but the mountain had other plans. Half buried in a snowbank, he saw her, a woman, her coat torn, one sleeve dark with blood. Beside her, a girl, no more than 8, tugged at her mother's arm, mittens stiff with ice. The child's face was pale, her eyes wide and fierce, like a cornered colt's. "Please, save my mama," she whispered, voice cracking against the wind's howl. The words hit Silas like a bullet, sharp and unyielding. He dropped to one knee, snow groaning under his weight. The woman stirred, her lips cracked, breath shallow. "Clara!" she rasped, naming herself before her eyes flicked to the girl. "Mary." Silas's gaze swept the wound, a bullet graze, high on Clara's arm, bad, but not fatal. He opened his hands, palms bare, to show he meant no harm. Mary's stare didn't waver, daring him to walk away. He couldn't. Not when those eyes carried the same weight as the boy he'd failed. Without a word, he scooped Mary under one arm, her small frame light as kindling, and slung Clara over his shoulder. The wind clawed at them, but Silas moved steadily, boots carving a path through the drifts. Grit growled low, hackles up, sensing something the storm hid. The cabin squatted against a stand of pines, its logs weathered black, smoke curling from the chimney like a faint promise. Inside, the heat hit like a wall as Silas kicked the door shut. Grit stood guard by the threshold, eyes locked on the strangers. Silas laid Clara on his cot, peeling back her sleeve to reveal the wound's angry edges. He worked fast, moss to staunch the blood, whiskey to clean it, a needle threaded with catgut for stitches. His hands, rough as bark, moved with a soldier's precision. Mary dragged a stool to fetch water, spilling half in her haste. She scowled, cheeks flushed, but Silas only set the tin cup by Clara's side. "Sip slow," he said, voice low, like gravel underfoot. Clara's eyes fluttered open, glassy but alive. "Why?" "Help us," she murmured. Silas didn't answer, just tied off the stitch and cut it clean. Mary edged closer to Grit, crumbs tucked in her pocket. She held one out, mittens trembling. The dog sniffed, then licked her hand, tail thumping once against the floorboards. "See?" Mary whispered, a spark of pride in her voice. "He likes me." Silas's gaze softened, just a fraction, but enough to feel the cabin's silence shift. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, waiting. He glanced at Clara, her breathing steadier now, and felt the weight of her question. Why help? Maybe because the mountain didn't care, but he still could. "If this story's pulling you in," he said, almost to himself, "stick with us. Subscribe to the channel to hear how it unfolds. Share where you're listening from. It keeps this fire burning." His voice stayed steady, like he was talking to the dog, not begging, just offering a seat by the hearth. Outside, the storm raged, rattling the shutters, testing the logs. Silas sat by the stove, rifle across his knees, cleaning it with a rag in slow, deliberate strokes. Clara's gaze followed him from the cot, her face pale but sharp. "What debt keeps you here, Silas Boone?" she asked, voice quiet but cutting. He didn't look up. "Some debts don't take payment." The fire cracked, filling the silence. Mary curled against her mother, small hands clutching Clara's coat. Grit stretched by the door, ears flicking at sounds only he could hear. The mountain loomed beyond, its beauty cruel, its verdict unwritten. Silas gripped the rifle tighter, knowing the storm wasn't the only thing hunting them tonight. The fire's glow carved shadows across the cabin's walls, each flicker a reminder of the storm's unrelenting grip outside. Silas Boone sat rigid, rifle still warm from cleaning, its barrel catching the light like a warning. The mountain held its breath, but the silence inside was heavier, weighted with the presence of Clara and Mary, strangers who'd cracked open a life he'd bolted shut. Beyond the logs, the wind howled, carrying whispers of hoofbeats that hadn't yet reached the ridge. Trouble was coming, and Silas knew it as surely as he knew the burn of frost on his knuckles. Clara lay propped against the cot's headboard, her bandaged arms stiff, but her eyes sharp, cutting through the dim like a blade. Mary slept curled at her side, one small hand tangled in Grit's fur, the dog's steady breathing a counterpoint to the storm's wail. Silas's gaze flicked to the girl, her face soft in sleep, then back to Clara. Her coat, torn and blood-streaked, lay folded by the stove. Something had fallen from its pocket, a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges charred as if kissed by fire. He hadn't touched it, but its presence gnawed at him, like a coyote circling a campfire. Clara caught his stare. "You've got questions," she said, voice low, steady despite the fever's pull. "Ask them." Silas leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "That book," he said, nodding toward it, "ain't just a keepsake." Her lips tightened, and for a moment, the only sound was the fire's crackle and the wind's relentless clawing. She reached for the notebook, wincing as her arm protested, and opened it to a page scrawled with names, dates, and fragments of deals struck in shadows. "My father," she said, "was a miner. Honest. Too honest. Found proof of a land grab. Claims stolen. Men killed to keep it quiet. This is his ledger. Names of men who'd rather burn the truth than face it." Silas's jaw clenched. The names weren't just ink on paper. They were ghosts from his past, tied to the jailhouse fire that still seared his dreams. The Marshal of Cheyenne Wells, a man with a badge as crooked as his soul, and a mining boss whose money bought silence and fire. "Those men," Silas said, voice rough as gravel, "they the ones hunting you?" Clara nodded, her eyes holding his, unflinching. "They killed my father, framed him for theft, then shot him in the street. I took his book and ran with Mary. They won't stop till it's ash, and us with it." The air in the cabin thickened, the weight of her words settling like dust after a stampede. Silas stood, moving to the window, cracking the shutter to peer into the storm. Snow swirled, hiding the tree line, but he felt the eyes out there, waiting. He turned back, catching Mary stirring, her small voice murmuring to Grit in her sleep. The dog's tail thumped softly, and Silas felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the ice he'd let harden for 6 years. "You're carrying more than a book," he said. "You're carrying a war." Clara's gaze softened, but her voice stayed firm. "And you? What war keeps you here, alone?" Silas didn't answer right away. He crossed to the stove, tossing in a log that sent sparks spiraling up the flue. The memory of the jailhouse fire roared back, timbers collapsing, smoke choking the air, a boy's cries fading behind bars he couldn't break. "Some fights you don't win," he said finally. "You just carry them." Clara's eyes held his, searching, but she didn't press. Instead, she tucked the notebook back into her coat, her fingers lingering on the leather like it was a talisman. Mary woke then, blinking against the firelight. She slid from the cot, bare feet whispering across the boards, and crouched by Grit. "You're a good boy," she told the dog, scratching his ears. Grit leaned into her touch, a low whine escaping his throat, the first softness Silas had seen in the beast since he'd cut it free from a trap. Mary looked up, catching Silas watching. "Mama says you're helping us. Are you a sheriff?" Silas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Was something like that once. Mary tilted her head, considering. "You're nicer than the sheriff in town. He yelled at Papa." Clara's hand stilled on the cot, her face tightening. Silas caught it, the raw edge of her grief, and turned to the kettle to hide his own. "Water's hot," he said, pouring it into a tin mug. "Keep your strength up." He handed it to Clara, their fingers brushing for a moment, her skin warm despite the cold. She took the mug, her eyes meeting his with something like gratitude, but sharper, like she saw the man beneath the frost. "If this story's got you hooked," Silas said, his voice blending with the fire's crackle, "subscribe to the channel to hear what's coming. Tell us where you're listening from. It's like adding wood to this fire, keeping it alive." His words felt natural, like passing a canteen on a long trail, not a demand, but an invitation. The night deepened, the storm's roar muffling the world outside. Silas checked the door, the bar solid, the shutters tight. But the notebook's weight lingered, its secrets tying Clara's fight to his own. He sat again, rifle across his knees, cleaning it with slow, deliberate strokes, each one a way to keep his hand steady. Clara watched him, her voice breaking the silence. "You ever think of running, leaving it all behind?" Silas's hands paused, the rag still. "Tried that. Didn't take. Mountains have a way of holding you to account." Mary, now back by the cot, drew in the frost on the window with a small finger, etching a crooked horse. "That's Papa's," she said softly. "He promised me one before." Her voice trailed off, and Clara pulled her close, kissing her hair. Silas's throat tightened. He saw the boy in the jailhouse again, his small hands clawing at the bars. He shook it off, focusing on the rifle, but Mary's drawing stayed with him, a mark he couldn't erase. A sound cut through the storm, sharp, like a branch snapping under weight. Grit's head snapped up, ears pricked, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. Silas was on his feet, rifle in hand, moving to the window. He cracked the shutter, peering into the dark. Snow fell thick, but shadows moved beyond the pines, too deliberate to be wind. "They're here," he said, voice flat but certain. Clara stood, wincing as she reached for the Sharp's rifle leaning against the wall, its oiled cloth still dangling. "I can shoot," she said, her jaw set. Silas studied her, saw the steel in her eyes, and gave a single nod. Mary huddled by the cot, clutching Grit's fur, her small voice whispering, Don't let them take Mama. Silas chambered around. The click loud in the cabin's hush. Stay low, he told Clara. Keep her close. He moved to the door, rifle steady, the dog at his side. The storm outside was a beast, but the men it carried were worse. The notebook's secrets burned in his mind, names that tied Clara's fight to his own failure, to a fire he couldn't outrun. The cabin, once his fortress, was now a trap, its walls closing in as the hoofbeats grew louder. The mountain watched, cold and unyielding, waiting to see who'd claim the dawn. The mountain held its judgment in the dark, its silence broken only by the storm's howl and the faint, deliberate crunch of boots beyond the pines. Silas Boone stood by the cabin's door, rifle steady, the air thick with the promise of blood. Clara's eyes burned with resolve, her hand white-knuckled on the sharps, while Mary clung to grit, whispering to the dog as if her words could hold the night at bay. The notebook's secrets, names of men who'd burned truth and lives alike, lay heavy between them, tying their fates to a past Silas couldn't outrun. Hoofbeats thundered closer, slicing through the blizzard's roar like a blade through hide. Silas cracked the shutter, squinting into the swirling snow. Shadows flickered. 3, maybe 4 riders, circling the cabin like wolves sniffing a wounded elk. The leader, a man in a black duster, his badge glinting dull under the storm's gray veil, shouted, voice sharp as barbed wire, "Clara, hand over the book and the girl, or we burn you out." His words carried the same venom Silas had heard years ago, when a marshal's order turned a jailhouse to ash. Clara's jaw tightened, her rifle steady despite the tremble in her wounded arm. "They'll have to kill me first," she hissed. Silas met her gaze, saw the fire there, and nodded. "Then we fight." He swung the door's bar tighter, the wood groaning under his grip. The cabin was a fortress, but a brittle one. Logs weathered, roof creaking under snow's weight. He moved to the west window, Clara to the east, their positions a silent pact. Mary huddled beneath the table, her small hands buried in Grit's fur, her voice a whisper. "Stay brave, boy." The dog's ears flicked, his growl a low rumble that matched the storm's pulse. The first shot came like a thunderclap, splintering the doorframe. Silas dropped low, returning fire through the shutter slit. The Winchester's bark sharp and final. A scream tore through the night, one rider down, his horse bolting into the dark. The others scattered, their curses swallowed by the wind. Gunsmoke curled in the cabin, stinging Silas's eyes as he reloaded. Cartridges sliding into the breech with a click that felt like counting heartbeats. Clara was fired from her post, the sharp's deep boom shaking the walls. A second rider fell, his shadow crumpling in the snow. But the black duster man was still out there, his voice slicing through. "You can't save her, Boone. You couldn't save the boy, either." The words struck like a bullet, ripping open the scar of the jailhouse fire. Silas's hands faltered, the memory of flames and a boy's cries flooding back. He shook it off, forcing his breath steady. "Focus," he growled, to himself as much as Clara. She didn't flinch, her next shot tearing through the night, answered by a yelp from the shadows. But the posse wasn't done. A torch arced through the storm, slamming against the cabin's wall, pitch flaring bright. Smoke seeped through the logs, black and choking, as flames licked at the weathered wood. Mary coughed, her eyes wide with fear. "Mama!" she cried, scrambling closer. Silas's mind raced, calculating. The fire would force them out, and the posse knew it. He grabbed a bucket, dousing the flames where they bit the wall, but the smoke thickened, clawing at their lungs. Grit snarled, teeth bared at the door, sensing the men circling tighter. "Back room!" Silas barked, voice cutting through the haze. Clara swept Mary into her arms, the girl clinging like a burr, and ducked into the shadows. Silas barred the back door, but the fire's roar grew, the roof groaning as sparks caught the rafters. He turned to Clara, her face smudged with soot, eyes fierce. "When I say run, you take the girl and head for the ravine. Creek's your guide to town." Clara's lips parted, defiance flashing. "And leave you to die?" Silas's gaze was stone. "You keep her alive. That's the deal." He pressed 3 cartridges into her hand, his fingers rough against hers. "For the sharps, don't miss." Mary's small voice broke through, trembling but clear. "Don't go, Mr. Silas." She reached for him, her hand brushing his coat. He crouched, letting her small arms loop around his neck, her breath warm against his frost-crusted beard. "You're keeping us safe," she whispered, "like Papa wanted." The words hit harder than the gunfire outside, stirring something raw in Silas's chest. The cabin shuddered, flames climbing higher. Silas stood, rifle ready, and kicked the back door open. Cold air rushed in, mingling with smoke. "Now!" he shouted. Clara hoisted Mary onto her back and plunged into the storm, snow swallowing their steps. Silas fired into the dark, covering their escape, the Winchesters recoil a steady rhythm against his shoulder. A bullet grazed his arm, blood hot against the cold, but he didn't falter. The ravine was close, a narrow chute of stone and deadfall, a bottleneck one man could hold. He backed toward it, reloading by feel, the posse's shouts growing louder, their shapes closing in. At the ravine's mouth, Silas turned. Clara and Mary were shadows now, slipping down the creek's path. He planted himself behind a fallen pine, its bark rough under his hands. The black duster man emerged, his rifle glinting, a sneer curling his lips. "You're a dead man, Boone," he called, "just like that kid you let burn." Silas's vision narrowed, rage and guilt twisting into something sharp. He fired, the shot grazing the man's shoulder, forcing him behind a boulder. The other riders flanked, their guns flashing in the moonlight. Silas answered with lead, each shot deliberate, his breath steady despite the blood soaking his sleeve. The fight dragged, minutes bleeding into hours. Snow fell thick, covering the dead, softening the ground. Silas's arm throbbed, his strength ebbing, but Mary's voice echoed in his mind. Like Papa wanted. It kept him anchored, fighting like a man with something left to lose. "If this stand's got you gripped," he muttered, as if speaking to the mountain itself. Subscribe to the channel to see who walks away. Share where you're listening from. It's fuel for this fight. His voice was low, like a trail hand, passing a story by the fire. Not a plea, but a nod to those riding along. A rider broke cover, charging with a knife. Silas met him, slamming the rifle stock into the man's jaw, bone cracking under the blow. Another came from the side, but Grit lunged, teeth sinking into the man's leg, dragging him down. The dog's growl was a war cry, loyal to the end. Silas fired again, the black duster man retreating, his curses fading into the storm. The ravine held, but the cabin was gone, its embers glowing like dying stars. Silas leaned against the pine, breath ragged, blood pooling in the snow. The posse was beaten back, but not broken. He knew they'd regroup, and the ravine wouldn't hold forever. Clara's shadow flickered far down the creek, Mary's small form clinging to her. Silas chambered his last round, the click loud in the sudden quiet. The mountain loomed, its peaks silvered by moonlight, beautiful and cruel. He'd bought them time, but the cost was carved in his flesh. The marshal's taunt echoed. You couldn't save the boy. But Mary's face, her trust, burned brighter. Silas tightened his grip, ready for the next move. The dawn was hours away, and the mountain's verdict was still unwritten. Dawn broke over the Wind River Range, the sky a brittle gray. snow glittering like shattered glass under the first light. Silas Boone leaned against the fallen pine, blood seeping from his arm, staining the frost red. The ravine stood silent now. The posse's shouts faded, their tracks swallowed by the storm's last gasps. Clara and Mary were gone, their shadows lost to the creek's winding path, carrying the notebook that named the guilty. Silas's breath came hard, each inhale a knife in his ribs, but Mary's words, like Papa wanted, burned brighter than the pain. He wasn't done yet. He staggered to his feet, the Winchester heavy in his hands, its barrel cold as the mountain's heart. The Black Duster Marshal was still out there, wounded, but alive, his hatred a beacon in the dark. Silas followed the creek, tracking the faint marks of Clara's boots, his own steps faltering but deliberate. The forest opened to a clearing, the town of Elk Fork just visible through the haze, its smokestacks curling like prayers against the peaks. He caught sight of Clara and Mary, stumbling toward the sheriff's office, the notebook clutched tight. But hoofbeats echoed behind him, fast and heavy. The marshal hadn't quit. Silas turned, planting himself in the snow, rifle raised. The Black Duster man crested the rise, horse blowing steam, his shoulder bloodied, but his gun steady. "You're a fool, Boone," he spat, voice sharp as a spur. "That book won't change a thing." Silas's eyes narrowed, the memory of the jailhouse fire flashing, flames roaring, a boy's cries fading. "It'll change enough," he growled and fired. The shot clipped the marshal's hat, sending him diving behind a stump. Silas dropped low, pain searing his arm, but his aim held. The marshal returned fire, bullets chewing the snow, each one closer than the last. Grit bounded from the trees, teeth bared, launching at the marshal's horse. The animal reared, throwing its rider into the drifts. Silas seized the moment, charging forward, his strength nearly spent. The marshal scrambled up, knife flashing in the dawn's light. They clashed, steel meeting steel, Silas's rifle stock blocking the blade. Blood dripped from his arm, slicking his grip. But Mary's face, her trust, her drawing of a horse, kept him fighting. He slammed his fist into the marshal's jaw, bone crunching, and drove the knife into the snow. The marshal fell, gasping, his badge glinting uselessly in the dirt. Silas staggered back, breath ragged, the world tilting. He heard Clara's voice, sharp and urgent, calling his name. She doubled back, Mary at her side, the notebook now in the hands of a gray-bearded judge who'd ridden out from town. "It's done," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "The judge has the names. They'll answer for it." Silas nodded, too worn to speak, his eyes on Mary. She ran to him, small arms wrapping around his leg, her warmth a fire against the cold. "You kept us safe," she whispered, and the weight in his chest shifted, lighter than it had been in years. They limped into Elk Fork. The town's dirt street churned to mud under their boots. The judge's words carried over the crowd. Bounties on the marshal's men, enough to keep Silas in supplies for a year, but whispers of the jailhouse fire followed him. "Some say a man who let a boy burn ain't fit to walk free," a shopkeeper muttered. Clara stepped forward, her voice clear as a bell. "He's steadier than you'll ever know." Silas met her gaze, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. Spring came, slow and stubborn, thawing the creek's ice. Silas rebuilt the cabin, his scars aching, but his hands sure. He cut a new window, facing south, letting sunlight spill across the floorboards. Clara planted beans along the creek, her hands dark with soil, while Mary scratched a crooked horse onto the new door, humming a tune her mother had taught her. The mountain stood watch, its peaks softened by green, its judgment no longer a blade. Silas leaned on his axe, watching Mary chase a butterfly, her laughter sharp against the silence. For the first time in 6 winters, that silence wasn't a sentence, it was a beginning. The tale of Silas Boone, Clara, and Mary ends with sunlight spilling through a new window, a hard-won dawn after years of silence. What did their fight stir in you? Drop your thoughts below. Where did this story take you, and what stayed with you most? Your voices keep these trails alive, and I'm grateful for every one of you riding along. The mountain's still out there, holding more stories, and I'll be back to share another. Till then, keep the fire burning and let us know where you're listening from. See you on the next ridge.